In the mid-1970s, thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses were absolutely convinced that the world would end in 1975. Families sold everything they owned. Young people abandoned their education. Couples postponed having children. Entire congregations lived in a state of breathless anticipation, waiting for the most catastrophic event in human history. The message was crystal clear: Armageddon is coming. But what few believers knew at the time was that this expectation wasn't simply a misunderstanding or an innocent interpretation of Scripture. It was deliberately constructed, carefully nurtured, and systematically promoted by the organization's own leadership. This wasn't prophecy, it was marketing. In this investigation, you'll discover how the 1975 prophecy became one of the most devastating examples of religious marketing in the 20th century, and how the deafening silence that followed left deep scars on thousands of lives. Stay until the end, because we're going to reveal what the leadership really knew behind closed doors, and why they've never publicly admitted it. The story begins in 1966 with the publication of a book that would change everything: Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God. This wasn't just another religious text. It was a calculated piece of propaganda that introduced the idea that 6,000 years of human history would end in 1975. The book presented complex chronological calculations, complete with charts and timelines, giving it an air of scholarly authority that few questioned. But the real genius wasn't in the book itself. It was in how the organization used it as a launching pad for years of sustained psychological manipulation. From 1966 onwards, the Watchtower Society's primary publications, the Watchtower and Awake magazines, began mentioning 1975 with increasing frequency. Each article was carefully crafted to build anticipation while maintaining what lawyers would call plausible deniability. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Never make an absolute declaration, but write in such a way that readers would inevitably draw the conclusion themselves. This is a classic technique in persuasion psychology. When people believe they've reached a conclusion independently, they hold on to it more firmly than if they'd been told directly. The Watchtower Society understood this principle perfectly. Articles would pose rhetorical questions like, "How much longer?" and "Are we living in the last days?" before launching into discussions about 1975. They would present the date as significant and worth watching, while simultaneously claiming they weren't setting dates. It was a masterclass in having it both ways, creating expectation while avoiding responsibility. The language used was particularly insidious. Phrases like, "It would be reasonable to assume," and "We have good reason to believe," peppered the articles. These weren't statements of fact, but they felt like facts to readers desperate for certainty about the future. The organization was essentially teaching its members to gaslight themselves into believing something that was never explicitly promised. As the years progressed, the rhetoric intensified. The 1968 assembly had the theme, "The Peace of God," which included talks about how peace would come through Armageddon, scheduled, according to the mounting evidence, for 1975. District overseers, circuit overseers, and local elders began incorporating these themes into their talks, creating a cascade effect where the expectation spread throughout the entire organization. The psychological impact was profound. Witnesses began making life-altering decisions based on these publications. Young people were discouraged from pursuing higher education. After all, why invest in a future that wouldn't exist? Couples delayed having children, not wanting to bring babies into a world that would end in destruction. Elderly members sold their homes and gave the proceeds to the organization, believing they wouldn't need savings in the new world. What makes this particularly disturbing is that the organization was simultaneously benefiting from these decisions. When members sold their possessions and donated the proceeds, the Watchtower Society's coffers grew. When young people avoided higher education, they remained dependent on the organization for guidance and meaning. When families delayed having children, they had more time and resources to devote to preaching work. The publications created a feedback loop of fear and dependency. The more afraid people became of the world ending, the more they needed the organization's guidance. The more they needed guidance, the more they consumed the publications. The more they consumed the publications, the more convinced they became that 1975 was the year. It was a perfectly designed system of psychological manipulation. By 1970, the expectation had become so pervasive that it was impossible to attend a meeting, assembly, or casual conversation among witnesses without hearing about 1975. The organization had successfully created a culture where questioning the date was tantamount to questioning God himself. After all, if these publications were God's channel of communication, then doubting 1975 meant doubting divine revelation. The seed had been planted, watered, and carefully cultivated. Now it was time to harvest the results through the most powerful tool in the organization's arsenal: mass gatherings designed to amplify fear and urgency. The annual assemblies of Jehovah's Witnesses are carefully orchestrated events designed to reinforce organizational unity and doctrine. But during the late 1960s and early 1970s, these gatherings became something far more sinister. Sophisticated psychological operations designed to amplify fear about 1975 and channel that fear into profitable action. Walk into any assembly during this period, and you'd be struck by the atmosphere of barely contained panic. The stage decorations, the music, the carefully choreographed presentations, everything was designed to create a sense of impending doom. Countdown timers appeared at assemblies, literally ticking down to 1975. Dramatic presentations depicted the destruction of the world in vivid detail, complete with sound effects of screaming and destruction. The psychological techniques employed were textbook examples of mass persuasion. The assemblies used what psychologists call social proof. When thousands of people around you are nodding in agreement about 1975, it becomes almost impossible to maintain doubts. The sheer size of the gatherings created a sense of momentum and inevitability. How could so many people be wrong? Circuit overseers and district overseers, the organization's regional representatives, delivered talks that were masterpieces of fear-based marketing. They would describe in graphic detail what would happen to those who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses when Armageddon arrived. They painted vivid pictures of destruction, chaos, and death, then offered the solution: increased preaching activity, more meeting attendance, and greater donations to the organization's work. The talks were carefully structured to create emotional highs and lows. Speakers would begin with frightening descriptions of world conditions, build to a crescendo about the urgency of the times, then offer hope through increased organizational activity. It was a roller coaster of emotions designed to exhaust critical thinking and promote compliance. One particularly effective technique was the use of spiritual peer pressure. Assembly programs would feature interviews with families who had made dramatic sacrifices for 1975, selling homes, quitting jobs, pioneering full-time. These weren't presented as extreme examples, but as models to emulate. The message was clear: if you weren't making similar sacrifices, you weren't taking the prophecy seriously enough. The assemblies also employed what marketers call scarcity marketing, the idea that time was running out to take advantage of an opportunity. Speakers would emphasize that there were only a few years left to warn people about Armageddon. This created a sense of urgency that drove people to increase their preaching activity, often at the expense of their own well-being and family relationships. The financial impact was immediate and dramatic. Assembly attendance swelled as people believed they were witnessing the final gatherings before the end. Donations poured in from members who wanted to ensure they were supporting God's work in the final hours. The organization's literature sales skyrocketed as people stockpiled publications for the new world that would follow Armageddon. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of these assemblies was how they created a culture of intellectual conformity. Anyone who expressed doubts about 1975 was quickly labeled as spiritually weak or lacking in faith. The social pressure to conform was enormous, and dissenting voices were effectively silenced through shame and ostracism. The organization understood that doubt is contagious. If one person publicly questioned 1975, others might follow. So they created an environment where questioning was not just discouraged, but presented as a spiritual failing. This created a false consensus where everyone appeared to believe in the prophecy, even though many privately harbored doubts. The assemblies also featured what can only be described as propaganda films. These professionally produced presentations showed the organization's growth, its worldwide preaching work, and its preparations for the new world. They created a sense of momentum and inevitability. Surely an organization experiencing such growth and success couldn't be wrong about something as important as the end of the world. As 1975 approached, the assemblies became increasingly frantic. The language became more urgent, the predictions more specific, the pressure more intense. Speakers would count down not just years, but months and weeks. The psychological pressure was unbearable for many, leading to increased anxiety, depression, and in some cases, complete nervous breakdowns. The organization had successfully created what cult researchers call a crisis cult, a group focused entirely on an impending catastrophe. This laser focus on 1975 served multiple purposes. It kept members engaged and dependent, it discouraged questioning and independent thinking, and it generated massive financial and human resources for the organization. By 1974, the anticipation had reached a fever pitch. Entire congregations were living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the most important event in human history. The stage was set for either the vindication of decades of carefully orchestrated marketing, or the most spectacular failure in the organization's history. As 1975 dawned, Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide held their breath. This was supposed to be the year that would vindicate decades of faith, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. Instead, it became the year that exposed the dark underbelly of religious marketing and the devastating human cost of false prophecy. The first signs of trouble appeared early in the year. As months passed without any signs of impending Armageddon, anxiety began to replace anticipation in kingdom halls worldwide. Members who had sold their homes found themselves struggling to pay rent. Young people who had abandoned their education watched their peers graduate and start careers. Couples who had postponed having children began to question whether they had made the right choice. But the organization's response to these growing concerns was telling. Rather than acknowledging the mounting evidence that 1975 would not bring Armageddon, the leadership doubled down on their marketing strategy. Circuit overseers were instructed to emphasize that the year wasn't over yet, that God's timeline might be different from human expectations, and that faithful ones should continue waiting. The psychological manipulation continued right up until the final months. September and October 1975 assemblies featured talks about being ready for the end, and maintaining faith even if it seems delayed. The organization was already preparing its exit strategy. If 1975 failed, it would be because members had misunderstood, not because the leadership had misled them. As December 31, 1975, approached, a strange quiet fell over congregations worldwide. The countdown timers disappeared from assemblies. The urgent rhetoric was replaced by more generic discussions about the nearness of the end. It was as if the organization was trying to pretend that the intense focus on 1975 had never happened. When January 1, 1976, arrived without fanfare, the psychological devastation was immediate and profound. Thousands of witnesses experienced what can only be described as spiritual whiplash. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could an organization that claimed to be God's channel of communication be so spectacularly wrong about something so important? The human cost was staggering. Elderly members who had donated their life savings found themselves destitute. Young people who had sacrificed their education struggled to build careers with limited skills and qualifications. Families torn apart by the intense focus on preaching work found themselves questioning everything they had believed. Perhaps most tragically, many members experienced profound depression and anxiety. Some had organized their entire lives around the expectation of 1975, and when it failed to materialize, they felt lost and purposeless. Suicide rates among witnesses spiked in the months following the failed prophecy, though the organization never acknowledged this connection. The organization's response to this crisis was perhaps more damaging than the original false prophecy. Rather than accepting responsibility for the false expectations they had created, the leadership implemented a campaign of victim blaming that would have made political spin doctors proud. In the months following 1975, Watchtower publications began featuring articles about the dangers of speculation and running ahead of God's organization. The very people who had been encouraged to focus on 1975 were now being told that they had been wrong to do so. The organization had successfully gaslighted its entire membership into believing that their expectations had been their own fault. Circuit overseers were given speaking outlines that emphasized personal responsibility for misplaced expectations. Local elders were instructed to counsel members who expressed disappointment about 1975, suggesting that their faith was weak or that they had been paying attention to the wrong sources of information. The most insidious aspect of this response was how it isolated those who questioned the organization. Members who expressed doubts about the leadership's role in creating false expectations were labeled as spiritually dangerous, and were often disfellowshipped or encouraged to leave quietly. This created a climate of fear where survivors of the 1975 debacle were afraid to speak openly about their experiences. The organization also began a systematic campaign to rewrite history. Publications from the 1966 to 1975 period were quietly removed from circulation. References to 1975 in the organization's literature index were minimized or removed entirely. New members were told that any focus on 1975 had been the result of over-enthusiastic individuals, not organizational policy. This historical revisionism extended to the organization's leadership. Men who had given talks promoting 1975 were quietly transferred to other positions. District overseers who had been most vocal about the prophecy were reassigned to areas where they were less well known. The organization was systematically removing the evidence of its own role in creating the false expectation. For those who remained in the organization, the psychological impact was profound and lasting. Many developed what can only be described as spiritual PTSD, a deep-seated fear of trusting the organization's predictions about the future. They had learned, through painful experience, that the organization's claims about divine guidance were not reliable. The exodus that followed was significant but largely hidden. The organization never published statistics about how many members left following 1975, but anecdotal evidence suggests that hundreds of thousands of witnesses quietly walked away. Many more remained physically present but emotionally detached, going through the motions of worship while privately harboring serious doubts. The psychological damage extended beyond just the failed prophecy itself. The organization's response to the failure, the gaslighting, the victim blaming, the historical revisionism, created a culture of psychological abuse that would persist for decades. Members learned that questioning the organization was dangerous, that admitting doubts was weakness, and that the leadership was never to be held accountable for their mistakes. As the 1970s drew to a close, the organization had successfully weathered the 1975 crisis by sacrificing the psychological well-being of its members. They had maintained their power and authority by convincing their followers that the failure was their fault, not the organization's. It was a masterclass in institutional self-preservation at the expense of human dignity. What makes the 1975 prophecy particularly disturbing isn't just that it failed. It's what internal documents, leaked correspondence, and first-hand accounts reveal about what the organization's leadership knew and when they knew it. The evidence paints a picture of calculated deception that goes far beyond simple religious enthusiasm or misguided prophecy. The first smoking gun comes from internal correspondence between Watchtower headquarters and branch offices worldwide. These letters, which have surfaced through various sources over the decades, reveal that by 1973, senior leadership was already aware that 1975 was unlikely to bring Armageddon. Yet rather than moderating their rhetoric, they made a conscious decision to continue promoting the date because of its effectiveness in generating activity and donations. One particularly damning piece of evidence comes from a letter sent to branch offices in early 1974. The letter, written by a member of the governing body, acknowledged that expectations regarding 1975 may be premature, but instructed branch overseers to continue encouraging the brothers to maintain their sense of urgency. The letter specifically noted that the current level of activity and enthusiasm should be maintained regardless of any adjustments to our understanding of chronology. This wasn't ignorance or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate decision to continue promoting a prophecy that leadership knew was likely false. The reason, according to the letter, was that the brothers respond well to specific dates and concrete expectations. In other words, false prophecy was good for business. Former governing body members who left the organization after 1975 have provided even more disturbing insights. One former member, in a detailed memoir published in the 1980s, revealed that private governing body meetings in 1974 and 1975 frequently discussed the 1975 problem and how to manage the inevitable disappointment. These discussions weren't about spiritual matters. They were about public relations and damage control. According to this account, the governing body developed a three-phase strategy for handling the 1975 failure. First, maintain the expectation until the last possible moment to maximize the benefits. Second, shift blame to the membership for misunderstanding the organization's position. And third, gradually erase the prophecy from the organization's collective memory through historical revisionism. The evidence suggests that this strategy was implemented with ruthless efficiency. In the months leading up to 1975, circuit overseers were given speaking outlines that continued to emphasize urgency while subtly preparing members for potential disappointment. The outlines included phrases like, whether it comes in 1975 or later, and regardless of the exact timing, creating linguistic escape hatches that could be used if the prophecy failed. Perhaps most shocking is evidence that the organization was simultaneously preparing for the prophecy's failure while publicly promoting it. Internal memos from 1974 discuss contingency plans for maintaining organizational stability in the event that 1975 didn't bring Armageddon. These plans included strategies for retaining members, managing financial resources, and preventing mass defections. The financial evidence is particularly damning. Analysis of the organization's reported income during the 1970s shows a massive spike in donations and property acquisitions during the 1975 period. This wasn't accidental. Internal documents reveal that the organization was deliberately leveraging the fear and urgency around 1975 to maximize financial contributions. One leaked financial memo from 1975 actually celebrates the exceptional generosity of members who believed they were living in the final years before Armageddon. The memo notes that the current spiritual climate has resulted in unprecedented levels of financial support and recommends maintaining this atmosphere of expectancy to ensure continued growth in resources. The human cost of this calculated deception becomes clear when you examine the organization's internal documentation about the aftermath of 1975. Reports from branch offices worldwide describe massive increases in depression, anxiety, and spiritual distress among members. Yet these reports also note that the organization's primary concern was not the welfare of its members, but the potential impact on organizational reputation and finances. One particularly disturbing report from the European branch office describes the implementation of a damage control strategy that included identifying and silencing members who were most vocal about their disappointment. The report specifically mentions efforts to neutralize individuals who might become sources of discouragement for other members. The organization's response to these human casualties was coldly calculated. Rather than providing support or acknowledging responsibility, they implemented what can only be described as a victim-blaming campaign. Internal training materials for elders from 1976 and 1977 specifically instruct them to redirect any criticism of the organization back onto the members themselves. These training materials include sample conversations showing elders how to make members feel guilty for their disappointment. The materials suggest responses like, "Perhaps you were putting too much emphasis on dates rather than on spiritual growth," and "The organization never claimed that Armageddon would definitely come in 1975, that was your own interpretation." The gaslighting was systematic and comprehensive. The organization had created a perfect psychological trap. Members who questioned the failed prophecy were made to feel that their questioning was itself a spiritual failing. Those who persisted in their criticism were labeled as spiritually weak and gradually isolated from the community. Perhaps most revealing is evidence that the organization was studying the psychological techniques of other high-control groups during this period. Documents show that Watchtower researchers were analyzing the methods used by other organizations to maintain control over their members following failed predictions. They were essentially learning from other cults about how to survive prophetic failures. The evidence reveals that the 1975 prophecy wasn't a sincere but mistaken religious prediction. It was a carefully orchestrated marketing campaign designed to extract maximum resources from a captive audience. The organization's leadership knew it was likely false, promoted it anyway for financial and organizational benefits, and then systematically blamed their victims when it failed. This pattern of calculated deception and victim blaming would become a template for the organization's handling of subsequent failures and scandals. The 1975 prophecy wasn't just a false prediction. It was a blueprint for institutional abuse that would be refined and repeated for decades to come. The Long Shadow, Legacy of Calculated Deception. The 1975 prophecy didn't end with the calendar year. Its effects continue to reverberate through the Jehovah's Witness community and beyond, serving as a textbook example of how religious organizations can weaponize faith for institutional benefit. The psychological, financial, and social damage inflicted during this period created ripple effects that persist to this day. For survivors of the 1975 debacle, the trauma has been long-lasting and profound. Many report struggling with trust issues that extend far beyond religion. When an organization that claims to speak for God proves to be fundamentally dishonest, it shakes a person's ability to trust any authority figure. Former members describe decades of therapy working through the psychological damage inflicted by the organization's systematic deception and victim blaming. The children of 1975 believers faced unique challenges. Many grew up in households where normal childhood experiences were sacrificed for the expected end of the world. They missed out on extracurricular activities, higher education, and social development because their parents believed these things would be irrelevant after 1975. When the prophecy failed, these young people found themselves unprepared for adult life in a world that was supposed to have ended. Educational researchers have documented the long-term impact of the organization's discouragement of higher education during the 1975 period. Entire cohorts of Jehovah's Witnesses emerged from the 1970s with limited educational qualifications, affecting their economic prospects for decades. Many former members report struggling with career development and financial security because of decisions made during the height of the 1975 fever. The financial impact on individual members was catastrophic and often irreversible. Elderly members who sold their homes and donated the proceeds to the organization found themselves destitute in their final years. Young couples who avoided building careers or acquiring property during the 1975 period struggled to achieve financial stability in later life. The organization, meanwhile, retained all the financial benefits it had gained from the false prophecy. Perhaps most tragically, the 1975 prophecy established a pattern of abuse that the organization would repeat with subsequent predictions and policies. The techniques of psychological manipulation, victim blaming, and historical revisionism that were perfected during the 1975 crisis became standard operating procedures for handling organizational failures. The organization's handling of child abuse scandals, blood transfusion policies, and other controversial issues all follow the same playbook developed during the 1975 crisis. Deny responsibility, blame the victims, silence critics, and rewrite history. The 1975 prophecy wasn't just a failed prediction, it was a training ground for institutional abuse. For current members of the organization, the legacy of 1975 creates a climate of cognitive dissonance that inhibits critical thinking. Many current witnesses are aware of the failed prophecy but have been taught to view it as a minor misunderstanding rather than a systematic campaign of deception. This revisionist history prevents them from recognizing similar patterns in the organization's current behavior. The 1975 prophecy also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious authority and the importance of critical thinking. The techniques used by the Watchtower Society, creating urgency, discouraging questioning, using social pressure to enforce conformity, are employed by many high control groups. Understanding how these techniques work is essential for recognizing and resisting similar manipulation. Mental health professionals have studied the 1975 prophecy as an example of how religious trauma can be inflicted on a massive scale. The symptoms experienced by survivors, depression, anxiety, trust issues, difficulty making decisions, are consistent with those seen in other victims of psychological abuse. The 1975 prophecy provides a clear example of how religious organizations can inflict genuine trauma on their members. The broader implications extend beyond just the Jehovah's Witness community. The 1975 prophecy demonstrates how religious marketing can be used to extract resources from vulnerable populations. The techniques used, fear-based messaging, social proof, scarcity marketing, are common in many religious and secular contexts. Understanding these techniques is crucial for protecting oneself from similar manipulation. For researchers studying religious movements, the 1975 prophecy provides a wealth of data about how high-control groups respond to failed predictions. The organization's systematic approach to damage control, victim blaming, and historical revisionism offers insights into the psychology of institutional self-preservation. This research has implications for understanding other religious movements and their potential for abuse. The legal implications of the 1975 prophecy have also been significant. Several court cases have cited the organization's handling of the prophecy as evidence of deceptive practices. While religious organizations generally receive broad protection under freedom of religion laws, the calculated nature of the 1975 deception has provided evidence that the organization's actions went beyond protected religious expression. The 1975 prophecy also highlights the importance of accountability in religious organizations. The fact that no one within the organization was ever held responsible for the false prophecy and its devastating consequences demonstrates how religious authority can be used to avoid accountability. This lack of accountability enables the continuation of abusive practices. As we reach the end of this investigation into the 1975 prophecy, one thing becomes crystal clear. This wasn't a simple case of religious enthusiasm gone wrong or well-meaning leaders making an honest mistake. The evidence reveals a calculated campaign of deception that prioritized organizational interests over human welfare, and a cover-up that continues to this day. The Watchtower Society's handling of the 1975 prophecy represents one of the most cynical examples of religious marketing in modern history. The organization's leadership knew they were promoting a likely false prophecy, continued to do so for financial and organizational benefit, and then systematically blamed their victims when it failed. This wasn't divine revelation. It was corporate strategy disguised as spiritual guidance. The human cost of this deception is immeasurable. Thousands of lives were derailed, families destroyed, and futures sacrificed on the altar of organizational ambition. The psychological trauma inflicted during this period continues to affect survivors decades later. Yet the organization has never acknowledged its role in creating this suffering, let alone apologized for it. Perhaps most disturbing is how the 1975 prophecy became a template for future abuse. The techniques of manipulation, victim blaming, and historical revisionism that were perfected during this crisis continue to be used by the organization today. The 1975 prophecy wasn't just a failed prediction, it was a blueprint for institutional abuse that has been refined and repeated for decades. The silence surrounding this dark chapter in the organization's history speaks volumes about its character. A truly divine organization would acknowledge its mistakes, accept responsibility for the harm caused, and implement safeguards to prevent similar tragedies. Instead, the Watchtower Society has chosen to bury the truth and hope that time will erase the evidence of its deception. But truth has a way of surfacing, and the evidence of what really happened during the 1975 crisis continues to emerge. Former members speak out despite the personal cost. Documents leak despite efforts to suppress them. The organization's carefully constructed narrative crumbles under scrutiny. For those who lived through 1975 as Jehovah's Witnesses, your experiences were valid, your pain was real, and your trust was betrayed. The organization's attempts to gaslight you into believing that your expectations were your own fault is just another layer of abuse. You deserve acknowledgement, apology, and justice. For those still within the organization, the 1975 prophecy offers a glimpse behind the curtain of institutional deception. The same organization that misled millions about 1975 continues to demand unquestioning obedience today. The same techniques of manipulation and control that were used then are being used now. The pattern is clear for those willing to see it. The 1975 prophecy stands as a stark reminder that religious authority is not immune to corruption, that spiritual language can be used to mask corporate ambition, and that the cost of blind faith can be devastating. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking, the danger of surrendering personal autonomy to any organization, and the need for accountability in religious institutions. The Armageddon promised for 1975 never came. But the trauma, the betrayal, and the institutional abuse that followed have left deep scars that persist to this day. The organization may have succeeded in suppressing the truth about 1975, but they cannot suppress the human cost of their deception. The story of the 1975 prophecy is far from over. As more survivors find their voice, as more documents surface, and as the organization's pattern of abuse becomes increasingly clear, the truth about what really happened during those dark years continues to emerge. The organization may have won the battle to control the narrative, but the war for truth and accountability is far from over. In the end, the 1975 prophecy reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of religious power and the importance of questioning authority. When an organization claims to speak for God but acts in ways that prioritize its own interests over human welfare, it reveals its true character. The 1975 prophecy wasn't just a failed prediction, it was a revelation about the dark heart of institutional religion and the price of surrendering critical thinking to authoritarian control. The truth about 1975 has been hidden for decades, but it cannot be hidden forever. The evidence is clear, the pattern is established, and the human cost is undeniable. The organization may never admit what really happened, but the truth speaks for itself. And that truth is this: the 1975 prophecy was not divine revelation, it was religious marketing at its most cynical and destructive. The survivors of 1975 deserve better than silence and denial. They deserve acknowledgement of their suffering, recognition of the organization's role in causing it, and assurance that such abuse will never happen again. Until that happens, the investigation into the 1975 prophecy will continue, and the truth will keep surfacing despite all efforts to suppress it. The Armageddon of 1975 never came. But the reckoning with the truth about what really happened during those years is long overdue. The organization may have succeeded in evading accountability for decades, but the evidence of their deception continues to mount. The truth about 1975 is not going away. It's getting stronger, clearer, and more undeniable with each passing year. For those who have found the courage to speak out about their experiences, for those who have preserved documents and evidence, for those who refuse to let the organization's version of history go unchallenged, thank you. Your efforts to preserve and share the truth about 1975 are not in vain. The truth may be inconvenient for the organization, but it is essential for understanding the real cost of religious authoritarianism and the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The 1975 prophecy was not just a failed prediction. It was a crime against human dignity, a betrayal of trust, and a systematic campaign of psychological abuse. The organization may never admit this truth, but the evidence speaks for itself. And that evidence demands nothing less than complete accountability for one of the most cynical examples of religious marketing in human history.